There are moments in this courtroom that I will carry to my grave. Not the verdicts, not the arguments, not the clean procedural satisfaction of a case resolved and a file closed. The moments I carry are the quiet ones, the ones that happen in the space between a question and an answer, the ones where a room full of people stops breathing at exactly the same time, because something true is about to be said. This was one of those moments. He stood in front of me on a Tuesday morning that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Delivery jacket, work badge still around his neck, eyes on the floor. The kind of man this system was designed to process quickly and forget entirely. The charge was serious. 104 miles per hour, in a 65 zone, at 2 in the morning. The kind of number that on paper doesn't leave much room for conversation. $2,300, license suspended, permanent record, open and shut. Except, I have been sitting in this chair for 38 years, and in 38 years you learn that the file is never the whole story, that the number the camera recorded is never, never the only truth in the room. There was something behind his eyes that the citation couldn't explain, something that had nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with something far more ancient than any law I have ever been asked to enforce. And when I finally asked him the only question that has ever mattered in this courtroom, what he said next silenced every person in that room, including me. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about justice, empathy, and hidden truths move something in you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. There are cases I carry with me long after the gavel comes down, not because they were complicated, not because the law was unclear or the facts were in dispute, but because they reminded me, in that quiet, unavoidable way that only truth can, why I chose to sit in this chair in the first place. I have been a judge for 38 years. 38 years of watching people walk through those double doors at the back of my courtroom. Young people, old people, frightened people, arrogant people, people who deserved everything coming to them, and people who deserved none of it. In 38 years, you start to believe you've seen the full spectrum of what human beings are capable of. The worst of it, certainly, but also, if you're paying attention, the absolute best. This case was the latter. I want to be careful when I tell this story because it would be easy, dangerously easy, to reduce it to a headline. A number on a citation, a line in a morning docket. That's what the paperwork said it was. That's what the system, in its procedural necessity, required it to be. But I've learned, slowly, and at great personal cost, that the paperwork is never the whole story. It never has been. The paperwork is just the door. What matters is what's standing behind it. That particular Tuesday morning, the sky over this city had decided not to commit to anything. It wasn't raining. It wasn't clear. It was that particular shade of gray that makes everything feel slightly unresolved, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how something would turn out. I remember thinking that as I walked from my car to the side entrance of the courthouse. I noticed it. I notice weather differently now than I did when I was young. When you're young, weather is just weather. When you're older, it starts to feel like it's trying to tell you something. The courtroom was almost empty when I took my seat. Morning dockets in civil traffic court rarely draw a crowd. No jury, no gallery of anxious faces. Just the fluorescent lights doing their low, persistent hum above us. The sound of institutional indifference, if indifference had a frequency, and the smell of old wood and recycled air that I have inhaled in rooms like this one for nearly 4 decades. There were 3 cases scheduled before mine. 2 were defaults, people who hadn't even shown up to contest their fines. The third was a minor parking dispute that resolved itself in under 4 minutes. And then the clerk called the next name. I looked up from my notes. He came through the door slowly, not the slow of arrogance. I know that walk well, and this was nothing like it. This was the slow of a man who had not slept, who had not eaten anything that required a plate, who was carrying something invisible on his back that had not given him a single moment of rest. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes not from a gym but from years of lifting and loading and hauling. His jeans had a tear at the right knee, not a fashionable one, a real one. His jacket was dark navy, the kind of synthetic material that delivery companies issue in bulk. The logo across the chest faded to the point where you could barely make out the brand. There was a lanyard around his neck with a laminated ID card on it, a work badge. He hadn't taken it off. That detail stopped me. He had come to court directly from his life. He hadn't gone home to change. He hadn't had the time, or perhaps the presence of mind, to remove the one object that told the world exactly what he was. A working man. A man in the middle of a shift that the universe had interrupted. He stood at the defendant's position with his hands clasped in front of him, fingers interlocked, knuckles slightly pale. His eyes moved to the floor almost immediately, and they stayed there. Not defiant, not calculating, just down. The posture of a man who was already apologizing before a single word had been spoken. I've seen thousands of people stand in that spot. Thousands. And in the first 10 seconds, before any charge is read, before any question is asked, I can usually feel the general shape of what I'm dealing with. Not the specifics, just the texture of it, the emotional temperature. What I felt that morning was not guilt. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the low-grade resentment that many people carry into traffic court like a chip on their shoulder. What I felt was grief. Not the grief of loss, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The grief of a person who has been through something they cannot quite explain yet, and who is not at all sure the room they're standing in is equipped to understand it even if they tried. I folded my hands on the bench. I looked at him. He did not look back. Not yet. The clerk read the citation in the flat, practiced monotone of someone who had read 10,000 citations before this one and expected to read 10,000 more. 104 miles per hour, in a 65 zone, at 2:17 in the morning. Rodovia Estadual 9, northbound, caught by a stationary speed camera at a bend in the road just past the old water tower that everyone in this county has driven past so many times they've stopped seeing it. The numbers sat in the air of that courtroom like something physical, like objects placed on a table for examination. The assistant prosecutor, a young man, couldn't have been more than 26, 27, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone still learning that the law and justice are not always the same building, shuffled his papers and began to read the attached penalties. $2,300. That was the base fine. On top of that, mandatory license suspension of 90 days. A permanent mark on his driving record, which, given that his driving record appeared to be his livelihood, carried consequences that no dollar figure could fully represent. And, should the court find aggravating circumstances, the possibility of a reckless driving misdemeanor charge, which carried its own separate weight entirely. I watched Marcus Delaney as each item was read. He didn't flinch at the dollar amount. He didn't shift his weight or tighten his jaw or do any of the small involuntary things that people do when they're hearing a number that frightens them. He simply stood there, still, like a man who had already done the math long before he walked into this room, and had already arrived at the conclusion that the math did not add up in his favor, and had made a kind of private peace with that fact, or at least a private resignation to it. That stillness told me something. It told me that whatever had brought him here, whatever had put his foot on that accelerator at 2 in the morning and held it there past every reasonable and legal threshold, was something he considered on some level to have been worth it. Worth the fine, worth the suspension, worth standing here under these humming lights with his work badge still around his neck, in front of a man in a black robe who held his immediate future in both hands. The assistant prosecutor concluded his summary and looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone waiting for a cue. I didn't give him one. Not yet. I looked at the file again, though I had already read it twice before entering the courtroom. Speed cameras don't lie and they don't embellish. They simply record. 104 miles per hour is 104 miles per hour. The law on this point is not ambiguous, and it was not written arbitrarily. Roads are shared spaces. Velocity beyond certain thresholds stops being a personal choice and becomes a public hazard. Every other vehicle on that highway that night, every other driver, every other passenger, every other human being moving through the dark in a metal container at highway speed, had been placed at elevated risk by the choices made inside one particular car. The law sees this clearly. The law was designed to see this clearly. And yet, 38 years. I kept coming back to that number. 38 years of reading people, of watching the space between what the paperwork says and what the human being standing before me is actually carrying. And the space I was watching now was unusual. It was not the space of defiance. It was not the space of excuse-making. It was not even the space of fear exactly, though fear was present. Fear of the fine, fear of the suspension, fear of what 90 days without a license would mean for a man whose income depended entirely on driving. It was something else. It was the space of someone who had lived through something recently and at close range and had not yet fully returned from it. I set the file down. I removed my glasses. I placed them on the bench in front of me and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of my nose, a habit I developed sometime in my 50s that my clerk calls the pause before the real question. She is not wrong about that. I looked at Marcus Delaney, directly, steadily, with no particular expression on my face, because expressions in moments like this one can close doors before they've had the chance to open. He felt the weight of the look and raised his eyes from the floor. Just barely, just enough. And I asked him the only question that had ever actually mattered in that courtroom, in any case, on any morning, in any of the 38 years I had been sitting in this chair. "Mr. Delaney," I said, and I kept my voice low and even, the way you keep a voice when you want someone to feel that the room is safe enough to tell the truth in. "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer right away. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the hesitation of someone constructing a lie. I have seen that hesitation more times than I can count, and it has a particular quality to it, a kind of internal busyness that shows itself around the eyes. This was different. This was the hesitation of someone who had the answer, had lived the answer, but was not yet certain that language was adequate to carry it from where it lived inside him to somewhere another person could receive it. He unclenched his hands, let them fall to his sides, and then he looked at me, fully, for the first time since he had walked through those doors, and he said her name. Lily. Just that. Just her name first before anything else. As if she needed to exist in the room before the story could be told. As if saying her name was the only honest place to begin. She was 8 months old, he told me. 8 months. His daughter. His and his girlfriend Priya's. They lived 20 minutes from where I was sitting, in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a building without an elevator, and he had been working that night, had been working since noon the previous day, 14 hours into a delivery shift, somewhere around his 12th or 13th run of the night, when his phone rang. He described the call the way people describe things that have been permanently engraved somewhere behind the eyes, not with drama, with precision. Priya's voice, the specific quality of it, not screaming, which might have been easier to process, but something worse than screaming. Something tight and controlled in the way that people get tight and controlled when they are terrified beyond the capacity for screaming. She said that Lily had stopped breathing right, that she had been eating and then she wasn't, and now her lips were... He paused here and swallowed, and the sound of that swallow in the quiet courtroom was one of the loneliest sounds I have heard in a long professional life full of lonely sounds. Blue. Her lips were blue. He had called 911 himself, he said, even as Priya was already on with them on the other line. The dispatcher had told him the estimated response time was 12 to 18 minutes. 12 to 18 minutes. He stopped talking. He looked at me to see if I understood what those numbers meant in that particular context, at that particular moment, to a father sitting in a car 6 minutes from his daughter. I understood. I have a daughter. I have always had a daughter. Even in the years when she was small enough that the thought of losing her lived in me as a constant low hum beneath everything else I did. Every ruling, every commute, every ordinary dinner at an ordinary table. That thought was there. Parents carry it. It doesn't go away. It just gets quieter as the children get older and safer, but it never fully leaves. It is the price of loving something that fragile, something that dependent, something that irreplaceable. 12 to 18 minutes. He pressed his foot to the floor. He told me he didn't remember making the decision. That was the detail that stayed with me. He said there was no moment of deliberation, no calculation, no conscious choice. The number came through the phone, and his foot moved, and the car accelerated, and he was on that highway going 104 miles per hour because there was, in his body and his blood and whatever it is that makes a parent, simply no other speed available to him. He got there in just under 6 minutes. He ran up the stairs. No elevator, he reminded me, almost apologetically, as if the detail mattered to me for some reason other than the reason it mattered to him. And when he came through the door, Priya handed him their daughter, and he did what Priya had shown him once from a video she'd watched, pressing carefully along the tiny back, and Lily coughed and breathed, and the blue left her lips. And 2 minutes later, the paramedics arrived and confirmed that she was going to be fine. She was going to be fine. He said those words, and then he stopped talking completely, and he pressed both hands over his face and his shoulders, those wide, work-built shoulders, shook once, just once, the way a structure shakes when something enormous passes close to it. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I did not look at the prosecutor. I did not look at the clerk. I looked at Marcus Delaney, and I thought about the alphanate on my lapel, the small silver pin my oldest daughter had given me on the day I was first appointed to this bench, 22 years ago now. I thought about the drive I had made once, not at 104 miles per hour, but with that same specific absence of deliberation, when a hospital had called me at 11 at night and said words I will not repeat here because some words, once spoken, retain their full weight forever. I thought about what it means to be the only moving thing between a child and the worst possible outcome. I picked up my pen. I held it over the file, and I began to speak. I told him that I was not going to pretend the law did not exist, that 104 miles per hour on a public highway is dangerous in a way that is real and measurable, and that the law's insistence on accountability in such matters is not bureaucratic cruelty. It is the accumulated wisdom of every accident that ever happened because someone decided that their urgency outweighed everyone else's safety. I told him that, clearly, because it is true, and because I have never believed that compassion requires dishonesty. And then I told him what else was true. I told him that in 38 years on this bench, I had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a person who disregards the safety of others and a person who, in a single compressed and desperate moment, simply runs toward what they love. That those two things are not the same. That the law, at its best, has always known they are not the same, even when the paperwork cannot tell them apart. I told him that no father who drives 104 miles per hour to reach a blue-lipped infant is a reckless man. He is a man in the grip of something ancient and overwhelming, something that does not have a speed limit because it was never designed to. I closed the file. The fine, I said, was dismissed. All of it, every dollar. The license suspension would not be imposed. The record would not reflect this incident in any permanent capacity. He would walk out of this courtroom today with exactly the same standing he had when he walked in, which is to say, the standing of a man who, as far as this court was concerned, had done nothing wrong. What he had done, I told him, looking directly into his exhausted, red-rimmed eyes, was something this court did not have the appropriate paperwork to process. What he had done was save his daughter's life. Case dismissed. The gavel came down. Thud. I have a small corkboard in my chambers. It hangs on the wall behind the door, which means you only see it when the door is closed and you are already inside the room, already in the private part of the day, the part after the robe comes off and the files are stacked, and the fluorescent performance of justice has gone quiet for the night. Most of what's on that board is unremarkable. Reminders, a photograph or two, a quote I cut from a magazine years ago and never got around to throwing away. But in the upper left corner, held by a single brass pin, there is a photograph of a baby girl in a yellow onesie, sitting on a patch of green grass in what appears to be a small backyard or a community park. She is looking at something just outside the frame, something that has clearly delighted her, because her mouth is open in the particular wide-open way that babies express joy before they have words for it. Her eyes are bright. Her cheeks are round. She looks in every visible dimension like a child who is entirely and completely fine. On the back of the photograph, written in the careful, slightly uneven handwriting of a man more accustomed to signing delivery confirmations than composing personal correspondence, are 11 words. Your Honor. She is crawling now. Thank you for seeing us. Marcus sent it 4 months after that Tuesday morning. No return address on the envelope, just the photograph and those 11 words, and a first name I already knew. I have presided over thousands of cases. I have written decisions that ran to 40 pages. I have been cited in appellate rulings and quoted in legal journals, and handed down sentences that made the evening news. I do not say this with pride. I say it only to establish scale, to give you some sense of the volume of words and arguments and legal reasoning that has passed through this room and through me over the course of nearly 4 decades. 11 words. That photograph and those 11 words contain more of what I got into this profession to do than most of what fills the filing cabinets along the east wall of my chambers. I think about Marcus Delaney when the work gets heavy, when the docket is long and the cases are grim, and the distance between what the law can do and what people actually need feels wide enough to get lost in. I think about him standing there in his delivery jacket with his badge still around his neck, hands clasped, eyes down, carrying something the paperwork had no category for. I think about the 6 minutes. I think about the stairs with no elevator. I think about Priya standing at the top of those stairs with a child whose lips were turning blue, and whose father was on a highway going 104 miles per hour, because there was no other speed his heart knew how to do. And I think about what it would have meant to him, to Lily, to every version of that family's future, if I had looked at the citation and seen only the citation, if I had seen a number instead of a name, a violation instead of a vigil. That is the temptation of this work, and it does not announce itself. It creeps in slowly, over years, disguised as efficiency and procedure, and the reasonable expectation that a man who has been doing something for a long time probably knows how it should be done. It whispers that the file is the person, that the charge is the story, that justice is a calculation, not a conversation. I have watched good judges lose that particular battle. I have watched it happen gradually and then all at once, the way all slow erosions eventually become visible. I have watched colleagues become fluent in a language that processes human beings without ever quite seeing them, and I have understood each time how it happened, because I have felt the same pull myself. On long Fridays, on the dockets that never seem to end, on the mornings when the gray outside the window matches the gray inside the work. On those mornings I close my office door, and I look at the photograph in the upper left corner of the corkboard, and I remember what this chair is actually for. It is not for the clean cases. It is not for the ones where the facts are unambiguous and the precedent is clear and the correct answer arrives already formatted and labeled. Any sufficiently sophisticated system could handle those. What this chair is for, what any seat of judgment in any room in any civilization that has ever tried to do this right is fundamentally for, is the cases that arrive with their full human weight intact. The cases where the number on the citation and the life of the person holding the citation are so different in scale that treating them as equivalent would be its own kind of injustice. Marcus Delaney did not need to be punished. He needed to be seen. And I have come to believe, after 38 years of sitting in this room and watching people walk through those double doors, that being seen, truly seen, without reduction, without the flattening that bureaucracy requires, and that human beings can never quite survive intact, is sometimes the most powerful thing one person can offer another. Not mercy exactly, not charity, something more precise than both. Recognition. The recognition that you are more than your worst moment, more than your most desperate decision, More than the number the camera recorded when your foot was pressed to the floor and your daughter was 6 minutes away and turning blue. You are the father who ran toward her, and this court sees that. Lily Delaney is a year old now, if my math is right. Maybe a little more. She is crawling in a photograph pinned to a corkboard behind a door in a room that she will never visit and may never know exists. But she is crawling. She is bright-eyed and round-cheeked and looking at something just outside the frame that has filled her small face with uncomplicated joy. She is breathing. That is, in the end, what justice looked like on that particular Tuesday morning. Not a fine, not a suspension, not a number matched to another number in a ledger that no one reads. It looked like a father walking out of a courtroom and going home. It looked like a baby, breathing. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in these 38 years of mine, something that reminded you of someone you love or something you would have done, then you already understand what I have spent a career trying to practice. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the system, at its best, still has a human being at the center of it. And if you want to be here for the next case, because there is always a next case, and some of them will break your heart in ways you didn't know were still available to you, then stay close, subscribe, and I will see you in this courtroom again. Court is adjourned. If this story moved something in you, stop for just a moment and ask yourself this. Have you ever made a decision, not out of selfishness, not out of carelessness, but out of pure and desperate love, that the world looked at and only saw the mistake? Have you ever stood in a room where someone held your worst moment in their hands and you needed, more than an acquittal, more than a reduced fine, you simply needed them to see you? And have you ever been the one holding someone else's worst moment and chosen, when it mattered, to look deeper than the paperwork? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, human dignity, and the justice that becomes possible when someone in power chooses to see a person instead of a file, then don't leave without subscribing, because the next case is already waiting. And I promise you, it will stay with you just as long as this one did.